Thank you for joining us for Nutrition and Physical Activity webinar on a dynamic relationship that can be satisfied by applying the available science. This webinar is being presented by Dan Benardot. He is a professor emeritus at Georgia State University and professor of practice in the Center for Study of Human Health at Emory University. He is also the author of the popular book ACSM's Nutrition for Exercise Science. During the presentation, questions can be typed into the chat box. These questions will be addressed in a follow-up blog post. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan for the presentation on nutrition and physical activity.
Thank you, Angie, for that introduction. It's nice to be here with all of you. I'm excited to give this talk, and I'm excited because first I was honored by having ACSM let me be the author for Nutrition and Exercise Science. But I'm excited because there's a lot of information out there on nutrition and exercise that's not well understood. So it's nice to have this opportunity to talk about this particular topic because of a lot of the misunderstandings that are around nutrition and physical activity. So let's get started with this. So to begin with, this may seem obvious, but even though it may seem obvious, the application, the way people respond to these things is not particularly good. So there is a big interaction between physical activity and nutrition. This interaction alters energy requirements. That is, it alters the rate of utilization differentially of carbohydrate, protein, and fat. And it also alters the amount of energy that you need. And because vitamins are very important for the metabolism of energy substrates, because an increase in energy substrate utilization occurs with physical activity, there's also an alteration in vitamin requirements. And because minerals are involved in carrying oxygen, in helping tissue repair, in communicating with muscles, there's an alteration in mineral requirements as well. And also for another reason, because physical activity sometimes causes a loss of minerals in the urine and almost always causes a loss of some minerals in the sweat. And there, of course, is an alteration in fluid requirements because exercise causes people to sweat, and if that's not well replaced, then there's a big problem associated with the ability to exercise. So let's look at what some of the key issues are. One is that optimal nutrient exposure requires diet variety. There is no perfect food. There is no such thing as a perfect food. This often gets athletes into a lot of trouble because they say, this is good for me, and they eat it at the expense of other foods that they may need. So we have to get across the idea that variety of foods is essential for making sure that tissues get exposed to all of the nutrients that they require. Also, it's not just eating and drinking the right things that's important. It's eating and drinking them at the right times and also in the right amounts. So all of those need to be considered to make sure that physical activity requirements can be adequately satisfied. We have to practice doing the right things all the time, because if you're not adapted to doing the right thing, then it won't be right for you. So it takes time. You have to, whatever you're going to do during competition, an athlete has to do during practice to make sure they're well adapted to it. And we also have to be careful that if you think something is good for you, you have to be careful that you don't have too much of it. More than enough is not better than enough. There are two reasons for this. One I mentioned earlier, which is nutrient exposure. But the other is that some foods, many foods, have something that might be potentially bad for you. And by varying the diet, then it's a little bit more sure that you won't get too much of something that might be potentially bad for you. So you don't know what pesticides were used to grow those vegetables you're eating. Well, if you eat a variety of foods, then whatever the pesticide dose that you get won't pass a threshold, which could cause a problem. So just consider how important it is to make sure that you have a varied intake. Hydration and energy strategy should focus on maintenance and exercise preparation, not just recovery. There's an amazing focus on how do I recover from this exercise, or how do I recover from getting dehydrated? Really, the focus should be, how can I avoid from getting dehydrated? How can I avoid getting low blood sugar? How can I avoid having my glycogen stores run out and then have to have a recovery strategy to recover so that the next day you can exercise? How about keeping things normal? Now that requires a lot of planning. It requires a lot of practice so that you can do the right things during physical activity, but the benefits are enormous. There are a lot of nutrition strategies to enhance long-term health. It's very important that if you're physically active, it doesn't matter what kind of physical activity it is. It could be power, team, endurance activity. The big issues revolve around optimally satisfying energy needs quantitatively, that is the amount that is consumed, qualitatively, the kind of energy which is consumed, and timing, that is the timing of intake, to avoid any particular substrate deficiency. Optimally satisfying fluid needs, again, quantitatively, qualitatively, and timing. There may be nothing better than water to drink when you're eating food, but when you're physically active, we know that we need to drink something other than water to make sure that we can keep blood volume normal and keep blood sugar normal as well. So again, it's quantitatively, qualitatively, and timing. We can't wait until thirst occurs or until underhydration occurs. The goal is to keep the athlete normal and optimally satisfying micronutrient needs. Again, vitamins and minerals, quantitatively, qualitatively, and timing. All of those are very important. Nutrition strategies to enhance long-term health. Well, there are many conditions that can affect nutritional status in an athlete. Of course, inadequate intake of energy, micronutrients, and fluid, which I have abbreviated here as EMF. Inadequate absorption of EMF, the way that foods are consumed, or the other foods that they're consumed with, or the way that fluids are consumed may impact the absorption of EMF. Defective utilization of EMF. I mean, are you consuming something that might interfere with the consumption of something else? So as an example, let's say you're taking some calcium supplements, and then you eat, and the food that you're eating has zinc or magnesium in it. Well, if you took a big dose of calcium as a supplement, that calcium could be taking up all of the absorption site, and it's going to interfere with the absorption of the zinc and magnesium or iron, which is in the food that you're eating as well. So defective utilization could be an issue. Increased excretion. Are you doing anything that might cause vomiting or diarrhea or cause you to urinate excessively? So increased excretion could be an issue, and increased requirements based on age, gender, and condition. Is a person injured? Are they growing? Are they pregnant? And so on, because those obviously impact what you need to eat, and satisfying that ends up being critically important. And poor timing of energy, micronutrients, and fluids in general, with all of these conditions considered, ends up being such a big issue, but it really needs planning in order for people to do the right things. There are a couple of contributing factors that are associated with poor nutrition in athletes. There might be organizational issues. So events sponsorship, sponsors may provide products at an event that the athlete isn't used to or may not be optimal for that particular athlete. But because those are the things which are there, then the athlete is obligated to consume them. They don't have any other options. There may not be credentialed nutritionists or dietitians available to help provide the right kind of advice. And bad advice is given by people who are not credentialed in the area. So that's a problem. National governing bodies may not have appropriate oversight in terms of what athletes are doing nutritionally to make sure that they have available for the athlete the right foods and beverages for them to consume during a competition, before a competition, after a competition, and so on. And then a lot of purveyors push supplements with very convincing advertisements that may not be the right thing for the athlete to consume, but they're pretty convincing, so athletes will consume them. And then very often training venues have bad rules that inhibit the easy availability of appropriate foods and beverages. So you may be a basketball player where that particular gym that you're practicing in doesn't allow you to have flavored sports beverages because they're afraid that if it spills on the floor, it might stick, it may look bad, it causes time for people to clean it up. So there are rules like that where the color of the floor is more important than the condition of the athlete. And I'm a little bit concerned about those rules. Knowledge is an issue. It's really important to make sure that athletes are educated in terms of what they need to do to optimize their condition capacity. Very often athletes copy other admired athletes, but they're different people. They may need different things. They may be in different sports, and they may be different ages. They may have different coaches. Very often an admired athlete is successful because they've just had wonderful coaches. They've been in the sport for a long time, and they eat something and then they say, well, if I eat it, I'll be as good as that athlete. Well, no, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Belief versus science, thinking that nutrition is a belief system and not a science. That I hear this all the time. Athletes say, well, I think that if I take this, it'll help me do this. Well, that's a belief system. Let's make sure that we give them science in a form that's easily applied. Misattribution of perceived benefit, where people think consuming certain foods and beverages actually may not help them for the reasons they believe. Because here's an example. There are studies that have been done which have found that a lot of supplements which target athletes contain banned substances in them which are not listed on the label. So an athlete thinks they're taking a vitamin mineral supplement, but this supplement has some form of testosterone in it. And they're saying, well, look at this, I'm taking these vitamins and minerals and look at my muscles grow. That's a misattribution. It's not the vitamins and minerals, it's the illegal testosterone which is in there. So it's very confusing because of these issues, which are very real issues. They're there. A lot of oversimplification results in problems. I mean, I know a lot of athletes who say, I know yogurt is good for me, so I'm going to eat it. Well, congratulations. Yogurt, you eat it all the time at the expense of other foods. Here comes anemia. It's pretty low in iron. So there's nothing perfect. You need variety, as I mentioned earlier. And a lot of athletes think that if they do one thing, it will give them the easy fix that they're looking for to get better. There's no easy fix. You just have to do all of the right things at the right times, and then good things will happen. This easy fix issue is a big problem. Tradition. There are a lot of traditions in sports that create nutritionally related problems, like, fasting before an event. I mean, that's probably the worst imaginable thing that you could do from a hydration and a muscle glycogen standpoint. The focus on weight. I want you to be at a certain weight before a competition. Really? We really have to think about the strength to weight ratio or the muscle to fat ratio, not weight. Because, if somebody loses weight, most of it's coming from muscle. What benefit is that? What, they think they look a little bit better? I'm sorry. As athletes go, they're not going to be performing very well if that happens. The belief that protein solves everything. It's amazing to me. I talk to a group of athletes and I say the word carbohydrate and they're expressionless. I say the word fat and they kind of frown. And I say the word protein and they go, ah, yes, protein. Well, you know, high protein intakes will not successfully resolve all potential nutrition problems. You need a balance of things, and you need it in the right amount. So you should consider that the energy substrate, which is most associated with athletic failure, is not protein. It's athletes not consuming enough carbohydrate in the right amounts and in the right times. That's really something that athletes need to spend a little bit more time thinking about. And then an excessive reliance on supplements. There is a belief system that if you take a supplement, you're covered. So you don't have to worry about the foods that you eat, right? And they may also cause world anti-doping issues because the WADA rules, are very clear that it's the athlete responsibility what goes in them. It doesn't matter if a banned substance is not on the label. The athlete is responsible because they consumed it. So better to have a food first approach because that's a much better way for tissues to be exposed to the nutrients that they need. And, a lot of people go on restrictive weight loss diets. We have to consider that thin is not the same as lean. There are a lot of people who are thin who have very little musculature and have relatively high body fatness. They would fall under the category of obese. What we want is we want to make athletes lean. That is, for their weight, we want them to have a lot of muscle and not so much fat. And weight loss diets very often produce the wrong things. There's a common misinterpretation of the dietary guidelines. And, if you look at the requirements for nutrients for which there is a recommended dietary allowance, the average requirement, the estimated average requirement, that's what that stands for, right? It's kind of like the 50th percentile in a normal distribution curve. Well, the recommended dietary allowance is 2 standard deviations above that. So most athletes would do just fine consuming the recommended dietary allowance. But there's a very important issue that needs to be thought about here, which is how much and when. The body works in real time. And a lot of supplements give you the full recommended dietary allowance in one dose. And the body would much rather have it in small, multiple doses. And a lot of people think, well, if that's the recommended dietary allowance, then having a multiple of that, 200% of it, 300% of it or more, is even better. We have to be extremely cautious about that. Just please consider that the body works in real time. So the recommended dietary allowances are daily general recommendations that have to be parsed out into multiple doses over the course of a day for optimal utilization. Physically active people maybe only need to modify a couple of those things. One is that sugar-containing sports beverages are appropriate for consuming during bouts of physical activity, right? So the recommendation that you inhibit sugar intake, I agree with that completely if you're not exercising. But if you're exercising, the rate of blood sugar utilization and muscle glycogen utilization is sufficiently high that having a strategy for mediating the loss by having some sports beverage, sipping on it at the right times is very appropriate. And also, the recommendation for sodium, the rule for athletes is you have to replace what is lost, right? You don't just have a flat recommendation for sodium. And so it's very important. Those 2 changes, I think, are important to consider. Very often, if I tell an athlete that they should be consuming a sports beverage, they'll look at me and they'll say, well, won't that make me fat? No, it's just the opposite. Because if they don't consume something that will help to keep blood sugar normal, then cortisol will rise. And the cortisol helps to break down lean tissue and bone tissue as well, so that the amino acids in the lean tissue, the glucogenic amino acids, can go to the liver. The liver converts them to sugar, and now the central nervous system can function normally, but at the cost of muscle. So the purpose of exercise is to enhance musculature, not to tear it down. So having knowing how to drink a sugar-containing sports beverage ends up being extremely important for making sure that the benefits of physical activity can occur. Dynamically satisfying the energy needs of training and competition is extremely important. A failure to consume sufficient energy at the right times has a lot of problems with it. So a lot of people who are on weight loss diets, they find that the fraction of weight loss as fat-free mass increases with the inadequate energy availability. That's the last thing you want. In other words, you're losing more muscle than you are fat. Adaptive thermogenesis, which very often takes 4, 5, 6 months to occur, that is, you become excessively energy efficient, makes it more likely that the weight recovery that you have will be higher body fat, not higher musculature. And it increases the risk for eating disorders. So restrictive eating is not a particularly good strategy for athletes. And, you know, if you restrict it enough, then you also increase the risk for developing a lower bone mineral density, which increases the athlete to the risk of stress fractures, which is not good. So the International Olympic Committee has a consensus statement. They published it twice, once in 2014, and then there's an update in 2018 on relative energy deficiency in sport. This is publicly available, and I encourage everybody watching this to get a copy and to read it. I'm very certain that if you read this, you will never, ever, ever allow anyone that you work with to go on a restrictive intake where it results in a relative energy deficiency. Basically, what this means is you don't have enough energy to do the things that you're asking your body to do at the time that you're asking it to do it. All right, so very important to consider this. It also kind of breaches the idea of the calories in, calories out paradigm, which is to say that if you need 3,000 calories and you eat 3,000 calories, then everything is cool, regardless of how you took that in. I mean, what that suggests is that if somebody had a 3,000 calorie dinner and didn't eat anything before that, that they would be in perfect energy balance. No, the body works in real time. So you, much like a car, you can never let the gas tank run out and you can never overfill it. That's really what relative energy deficiency in sport is referring to. And if you look at this, you can see that there are a lot of disease-associated problems, or immunological problems, menstrual problems, bone health, lots of disease-associated problems for athletes who go into a state of red S. And there are performance-related problems, decreased endurance, increased injury risk, decreased training response. None of these are particularly good. So one strategy that's incredibly important to think about is, can an athlete perform an activity and still have gas in the tank while they're doing it? Because if they didn't set themselves up right, if they're not consuming the right things during the activity, then there's a really big chance that they're going to go into an energy balance deficit that could create some of these problems. There are some papers that were written in 2018 which exemplify this very nicely. What they did is they took male and female subjects, athletes, who were consuming what was predicted to be the right amount of energy consumption. So let's say that they were predicted to need 2,500 calories and they were consuming 3,500 calories. So 2,500 calories, fine. No, depended on how they consumed it. So those athletes who went into an energy balance deficit during the course of the day that resulted in an energy balance deficit that exceeded minus 300 calories of energy balance, the female athletes had significantly higher cortisol, significantly lower estrogen, even when they were in a 24-hour energy balance state. Well, the higher cortisol means that they're going to tear down bone tissue and muscle tissue. Yes, it does lower fat tissue a little bit, but what good is that if you're also lowering lean tissue? And the lower estrogen is very important for inhibiting the activity of osteoclasts, which are the cells that break down bone. And the osteoblasts, which are the cells that build bone, can't keep up if you don't inhibit osteoclastic activity. So then bone density goes down. The male athletes also had significantly higher cortisol and a significantly lower testosterone to cortisol ratio, even if they were in a 24-hour energy balance state. So what that tells you is it's not how much you have in 24 hours. The pancreas doesn't wait until the end of the day to figure out how much estrogen, how much insulin it should produce. It works in real time. And we have to think about energy balance in real time, not just in 24-hour units. So it's very important to consider that exercise increases the rate at which energy is burned. Greater energy expenditure results in more heat production. And because humans are only about 30% efficient at converting burned fuel to energy, 70% of all the metabolized energy creates heat that must be dissipated to avoid a dangerous rise in body temperature. So the primary system humans have for this heat removal is the evaporation of sweat. And because exercise increases heat, we have a greater requirement to sweat in order to maintain body temperature. We can't acquire that heat, we have to dissipate the heat. The greater the energy expenditure per unit of time, the greater the exercise intensity, in other words, the greater the heat production and the greater the sweat rate to dissipate the produced heat. Well, we have to have a way to make sure that we can stay in a reasonably good hydration state so that blood volume can stay normal, stroke volume of the heart can stay normal. We need electrolytes, we need water, and we need sugar because blood sugar is taking a dive at the same time. In what universe is it okay to lose three things, electrolytes, sugar, and water, and replace it with only one thing, water? That happens far too often. So we have to have a way to make sure that athletes can stay normal by consuming the right things during physical activity. They need to have an optimal hydration and glycogen store before exercise, and they need to have a strategy for making sure it stays good during exercise as well. So the basic pre-activity energy and hydration strategy are: you consume foods that have basically starchy carbohydrates, low fiber, because fiber may inhibit the rate of gastric emptying and it can also make you feel bloated and uncomfortable. It's got to be easy to digest, somewhere between 2 to 4 hours prior to physical activity. Consumption of ample water with meals, because the meals have all of the electrolytes and the energy substrates in it that you need. You just need water to dilute it and help digest it and get it into the system. And sports beverages afterwards, right? So sipping 1 to 2 mouthfuls every 10 to 15 minutes on a sports beverage after you eat is a good strategy for making sure that the athlete will start the competition or the exercise session in a normal blood sugar state with muscle glycogen and liver glycogen where it needs to be. So that sipping protocol ends up being very important. The pre-exercise protein consumption should be from low-fat sources because fat delays gastric emptying and you want everything out of the stomach before you exercise. High-fat food should be limited to avoid gastric emptying again, so fried foods and so on are not something that you have before physical activity. And then periodically snacking with small amounts of easy-to-digest carbohydrate. It may be a very appropriate strategy, particularly if the pregame meal is greater than 3 hours prior to the activity. And the reason is that blood sugar, typically if you're up and during normal activity, can fluctuate in 3 hours. That is, you eat, it reaches its peak 1 hour after you eat, and 2 hours after that, blood sugar is back to pre-meal levels, starting to get low. You need to eat something again or to do something to get the blood sugar back up to normal. So having a strategy that's well practiced to make sure that this can happen is very important. Also need to follow hydration strategy to minimize underhydration and maintain blood volume and blood sugar. This won't happen unless fluids are nearby because accessibility ensures better fluid intake. It's got to be there. Athletes should have their own bottle from which to drink, and this bottle should be with them all the time. I tell athletes they're not in uniform if that bottle is missing. That bottle is part of the uniform. Coaches should design practices that enable athletes to drink frequently. That means having appropriately timed breaks so that athletes have an opportunity to sip. Very often what happens is that there are no breaks, and then at the end of competition or end of practice, an athlete will consume an enormous volume of sports beverage all at once. That's not the way to do it. That's not the optimal way. What you need to do is avoid underhydration by drinking during the physical activity so you never reach a threshold where the body is negatively impacted by the poor availability of blood volume. Coaching staff should be aware of athletes with high sweat rates to make certain they can consume sufficient fluids, because they may be at risk for overheating, big problem. And help athletes to learn to drink frequently by considering this to be part of the training regimen. Very important. It's also important to consider that there obviously are sport-specific realities that can make it difficult for athletes to keep a nutrition or hydration plan. I mean, this is a picture at the London Marathon, and you can see that it's kind of a battle in there and some athletes may say, well, I'm not going to drink there because it's just too difficult to get to my drink. And you can see each bottle has a slightly different design so that the athlete knows exactly where their bottle is so that they can grab it. There has to be a plan. There has to be a way. There has to be an emphasis on the importance of getting it. I would say it's so important for an endurance event like this that I would rather see an athlete just stop, walk, grab, than to just pass it by because they say it's too difficult. So it's incredibly important to have a plan to make sure that the right things happen. Post-exercise, also incredibly important, right? If you do the right things, it can reduce muscle soreness, it can make muscle recovery better, it can help support muscle synthesis. Good things happen if you do the right things post-exercise. When exercise training is completed, glycogen, both liver and muscle glycogen, is at its lowest point, and glycogen synthase, which is the enzyme that produces glycogen from available carbohydrate, is at its highest point. And glycogen synthase stays at its peak only for a short time. So it's very important to have some source of carbohydrate right then, right while it's at its peak, to help assure that you can get the carbohydrate consumed converted to glycogen and not fat. So have the following available. So 20 to 25 grams of high quality protein, 25 grams of carbohydrate, in other words, about 100 calories of each, and fluid right away. And then after that, you go on a frequent eating and drinking schedule as well. But having that available immediately afterwards ends up being very important to maximize the benefit from the physical activity which is being done. Far too often, weight is the marker of whether a nutrition strategy is working. But I think weight is the wrong metric for just about everything. I mean, this is 5 pounds of muscle and 5 pounds of fat, right? They're quite different. And if you want, let's say, someone who's in an appearance sport like figure skating to look good, it's not weight that you want. You want them to have less fat and more muscle, even at the same weight. They would be smaller, they would look better, but their strength to weight ratio would be far better if they had more muscle and less fat. If you just lower caloric intake, you're very likely to catabolize lean tissue, which is contradictory. So we have to do two things. We have to stop doing things that lower metabolic mass in athletes, and we have to stop doing things that increase fat mass in athletes. And far too often, we're doing precisely that. It's also important to consider what these words mean. Obesity does not mean having too much weight for your height. Obesity means having too much body fat by definition. Overweight means weighing more than the standard weight to height ratio, or BMI, right? Well, consider this. This person on the right with a muscular build, if you look at normal BMI standards would be considered overweight or obese because they have so much muscle for their height that they're heavy for their height. Well, they're not obese, obviously not fat, right? So it's important to differentiate between the constituents of weight. You know, when you look at these, we have to ask ourselves, weight may come from lean tissue. More of it's generally good. From bone mass, more is generally good. From fat mass, we would consider that bad if it's too much. And from body water, which is normally associated with lean mass, so we would consider that to be good, right? I mean, when somebody comes to me and says, would you help me lose some weight? I do everything imaginable to try to get their attention and ask them, what weight do you want to lose? Do you want to lose muscle weight? No. Do you want to lose bone weight? No. Do you want to lose water weight? No. Do you want to lose fat weight? Yes. Well, the strategy for losing fat weight but keeping lean tissue and bone tissue intact is completely different. The general strategy is to stay in a reasonably good energy balanced state so that you make sure you can maintain your lean muscle and your body is less motivated to store fat. So energy balance in real time ends up being very critical. It's also very important to make sure before an appropriate nutritional intervention takes place that you have multiple measures. I want you to imagine that you have the mean and the standard deviation for all the athletes on the team, and you find one athlete whose body fat level, let's say, is too high. Now you might be motivated to say, well, your body fat level is too high. We're gonna change what you're doing right now. We're gonna put you on a restrictive intake. But what if a month earlier that athlete's body fat level was even higher? And what if a month before that that athlete's body fat level was even higher without any intervention at all? This athlete is moving in the right direction. Why would you intervene in something that's already successful? Because your intervention may interfere with an already successful strategy. Let's look at the other scenario. Let's say that you measure somebody who's leaner than the average, but within one standard deviation of the team, and you say, wow, that's really good. I'm going to leave that person alone. But what if 1 month earlier they were leaner still, and 1 month before that they were leaner still? And clearly they're moving in the wrong direction. Maybe this person needs an intervention, but you would never know it if you just had a single measure. So we have to be a little cautious about just taking a single measure and having an intervention, because that can result in poor counseling and poor outcomes. We have to allow enough time to become well adapted to any new nutrition strategy by practicing that strategy during training. You look at marathoners, they have an opportunity to drink something every 5 kilometers. Well, if they don't practice drinking something every 5 kilometers during practice, they're never going to be able to drink as much as they should be able to drink because the body won't have adapted to it, okay? The other thing to consider is that a lot of athletes say, well, I've always been doing it like this, right? But if it's the wrong thing, you don't get your body to do the right things if you're following the wrong nutritional strategy, right? I mean, there are lots of studies with this, that people who have skipped a meal as adults, they end up with higher BMIs. People who skip meals as children and as adults, they have higher BMIs and more cardiometabolic risk factors. I mean, they've been doing it longer, and you would think that they would have adapted to it. No, the body doesn't adapt to doing the wrong thing, so you have to do the right things. There may be a tradition to induce dehydration with the belief that it makes the athlete tougher, more tolerant to dehydration. That doesn't occur. It's just dangerous. There may be a tradition that meal skipping is a satisfactory way of lowering energy intake to make a person leaner. But that doesn't occur. The opposite occurs. And just consider, it takes time for humans to adapt to change, right? So let's say that you find that an athlete doesn't drink enough and they're losing more than 2% of total body weight and it's negatively impacting performance, right? You can't all of a sudden quadruple what they're drinking and hope that you'll have a good outcome. What you can do is a couple of ounces every week add to what they're doing to get them up to a normal level and give their bodies an opportunity to adapt. Learning that consuming a sports beverage is better than drinking water during physical activity needs to be adapted to slowly. Give the person an opportunity to adapt, and if you do, really good things will happen. Kids, young athletes, I mean, if you calculate the amount of energy that a growing child requires, it's hard to imagine how they can get just that much energy. Now add physical activity on top of that, and boy, they need to eat a lot for their size. And we need to figure out a way to do it to encourage long-term health. We need to make sure that there are opportunities for young kids to eat in a way that dynamically supports the energy requirement, because if we don't, we can negatively impact them for the rest of their lives. We need to assure that they have optimal energy stores and hydration prior to training and competition, that they follow a hydration strategy that supports blood sugar and blood volume during competition, that they use a training recovery strategy that returns the athlete to a good state of hydration and energy balance after the competition. And we use body composition rather than weight as the marker of whether or not they're doing the right thing. And we need to allow enough time to for them to become well adapted to any new nutrition strategy. We have to have an environment that helps to assure that all of these things can happen. I mean, if I look at typical eating strategies of kids where they have breakfast before they go to school, and they have lunch at school, and then they have physical activity, and then they go home and they have a late dinner, that there's no way that can optimally satisfy their requirements. We need to figure out ways structurally to make sure that the environment encourages optimal nutritional intake by frequent consumption patterns and availability of beverages and snacks that are appropriate for them. There are gender-associated differences. Girls obviously begin their growth spurt before boys do. In females, a greater proportion of testosterone is converted to estradiol. That makes it a little bit more difficult for females to enlarge the musculature, so just know that that's normal. Delayed menarche is far too common in female athletes. It's associated with a female athlete triad, inadequate energy, dysmenorrhea, and low bone mineral density, a problem that can impact them for the rest of their lives. So it's very important to make sure that that doesn't happen. Iron status is an important consideration for both male and female growing athletes, and it should be assessed at least annually so that you can nip it in the bud if something bad is happening. It's particularly important when a female has menses because of the menstrual-related blood loss, but both male and female athletes should have their iron status assessed regularly just to make sure everything is okay. You can diminish age-related problems in older athletes through exercise, but it requires that they do the right things nutritionally. So we know that there's an age-related change in body composition that impacts resting energy expenditure, typically lower. There's a lowered capacity to quickly recover from intensive long exercise bouts, right? So we need to have a recovery strategy that takes that into account. There's a gradually diminishing bone loss. There are subtle changes in the gastrointestinal tract that could influence nutrient absorption. The classical example is it becomes more difficult to absorb vitamin B12, so pernicious anemia is more likely in someone who's older. Progressively lower heat tolerance, progressive decreases in the glomerular filtration rate and renal blood flow, so beverages that are consumed have to be mediated appropriately. There's a reduced capacity to concentrate urine, increasing urinary frequency, and potentially lowering fluid consumption. So all of these things have to be considered, but if you do the right things nutritionally, you can diminish all of these age-related changes. But we have to consider how we can get older athletes to do the right things nutritionally so that we can diminish it. So In summary, we have to take sport-associated tradition-based eating and make it sport-associated science-based eating. We have to take random food availability and make it chronic food and beverage availability. The focus on weight should be changed to a focus on body composition and finding an appropriate range of body composition for that individual athlete. Meeting daily nutrient requirements needs to change to meeting real-time nutrient requirements to optimize cellular utilization. Meeting energy requirements on a daily basis needs to be changed to dynamically satisfying energy requirements to avoid RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport, and to avoid large energy balance deficits. The focus on the pregame meal should focus on total eating behavior, including pregame meal, during exercise, recovery nutrition. We need to think about all of those. The incorporation of strange ergogenic aids of questionable value should be changed to the scientific use of non-banned ergogenic aids that are sport activity specific, but still only if there's a food first approach. There's typically almost no attention given to athletes on special dietary needs. We need to start thinking about, do they have a food sensitivity? Do they have a food intolerance? Do they have an allergy? We need to figure out ways to make sure that they can satisfy their nutritional needs if they're avoiding consuming certain foods because of those intolerances or sensitivities. And we have to have appropriate foods and beverages available. So plans to consider. So let's think about this. We need to have a food-first approach to meeting needs rather than relying on a pharmacological, drug-based, supplement-based approach to nutrition. Very important. That requires planning. It's more difficult. It's less convenient, but it's so much more successful. So athletes should develop a frequent eating strategy with foods that help them obtain the needed energy and associated nutrients and optimizes energy nutrient utilization. We need to optimize energy and hydration status before initiating exercise. They have to have a good strategy for fluid consumption during exercise to keep blood volume and blood constituents, primarily glucose and electrolytes, normal. And don't let the athlete leave the exercise venue without providing them with an appropriate recovery strategy, foods and beverages to optimize recovery. All of those end up being critically important for the health, well-being, and success of the athlete. I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk with you, and I want to thank the American College of Sports Medicine for being so supportive in my work. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Benardot, for this presentation from your vast experience as an instructor, a scientist, and a practitioner. Dr. Benardot is also the author of the popular text, ACSM's Nutrition for Exercise Science, which is published by Wolters Kluwer. You can find more information about this text on the American College of Sports Medicine website. Questions about this presentation can be submitted through the chat box. Questions will be addressed by Dr. Benardot in a follow-up blog post on the ACSM website. Lastly, thank you, our attendees, for taking time out of your schedules to attend this webinar on nutrition and physical activity, a dynamic relationship that can be satisfied by applying the available